Hey there, John here. We are back with another episode of our BIOS analysis. We are in the penultimate episode. I always like using the term penultimate. In this one, we're going to cover both the monitor and boot sections of the BIOS. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. See, I got the monitor section brought up, and a lot of this page is pretty self-explanatory, as it just provides temperatures or speed or voltages of various things that the BIOS is tracking. So we start with the CPU temperature, 51 degrees. That matches what we see over on the hardware monitor. Then we got the CPU package temperature, which is at 62 degrees. Then we got the motherboard temperature, which is at a chill 33 degrees. And then we got the chipset temperature, which is at 52 degrees. So all of these can be monitored and watched. Obviously, we don't want them to get too hot. Next up here is the T sensor temperature. There is a header on the motherboard to add an additional thermal sensor somewhere in the system. So if you want to do that to track an additional temperature, you're able to do that if you have the appropriate header to plug into the motherboard. Next up, we have some fan speeds. We have the CPU fan speed. This is my Noctua fan that is attached to the processor, currently running at 1650 RPM. And then we got the chassis fans that are, if I remember correctly, are all tied into the same header because they're all the same fans. These are Asus 120 millimeter, if I remember correctly, fans, and they're running at just under 900 RPM. Then you got the AO pump speed. If I was using a closed loop all-in-one cooler, you're able to plug the pump into the pump header and be able to monitor the pump speed. And then next up is the VRM HS fan speed. Now I have a VRM fan in this B550 motherboard, and it is spinning, but the speed isn't tracked. So I don't know whether there is something with my header or that because the fan is so tiny, the RPMs aren't being tracked by the motherboard. So I'm not sure why that is. Next up, we have the voltages that we've seen before. We have the CPU core voltage, that's 1.264. Then we got the various power inputs that are available to the motherboard, the 3.3 voltage, the 5 volt voltage, and then the 12 volt voltage. And those match up with what's over here on the right-hand side of the hardware monitor. Next up, we have the QFan configuration. This is actually a more direct input of the QFan control. And I haven't gone over the QFan control, so I will do that now. So on the QFan control, you have a visual representation of the various fans that are plugged into the motherboard. So you have the CPU fan, the chassis fan, and the AO pump headers. And then you could pick them, set them to PWM or DC, depending on whether they're 3 or 4 pin, and set different settings for them. Standard, silent, turbo, full speed, manual. Obviously, these are speak for themselves. Silent would run the fans as quietly as possible. Turbo would run the fans pretty aggressively. And then full speed would basically have the fans on 100% all the time. And then you can even have a manual where you can make up your own curve. And you can do this and tweak this in order to be able to manage sound, manage thermals, kind of all together. So if you're okay with your processor running at 50 degrees like I am, then maybe you don't have to have your fan on quite as high. If you want to make sure that the processor is running a little bit cooler, you can have the fan running faster, which would hopefully dissipate more heat, but that would create more noise. So there's a trade-off there, and it depends on what you're comfortable with. And it also depends on what you're using the system for. If you're now going to go in and start doing full bore overclocking, all of a sudden sound may become irrelevant to you and cooling may become the only thing that matters, in which case then you might want to have all the fans running 100% all the time to make sure you're getting the maximum cooling. But the same things are available in the QFan configuration. We start with the QFan Tuning, and this is actually a test that it would run through to kind of configure your fans based on how it detects the speeds that are available to the fans, and then it will set up a curve based on that that analysis that it does. And then next up we have the individual fan controls themselves. The first is the CPU fan. So again, you're going to be able to set it from either DC or PWM. Then you got the fan step up. This is the amount of time before the fan speeds up or slows down for the fan step down based in a response to a temperature change. And you may want to do this so that you don't have the fans constantly changing RPM speeds very quickly, which may become more bothersome than just the speed of the fan itself. You know, after a fan is running at a specific RPM for a period of time, you tend to block it out, or it might just become part of background noise. But if it's constantly going faster, then going slower, then going faster, then going slower, that may become much more noticeable and much more bothersome. So you have the ability to be able to delay how quickly it ramps up or ramps down based on changes in temperature. In this particular case, I just have it immediately changing if it senses a change in temperature. Then you have the CPU speed lower limit. This is the slowest speed that the fan will spin at. And then you have the CPU fan profile like we saw in the QFan control. I just have mine set up to standard. Same options appear for the chassis fan with one change, and that is it does ask you under the chassis fan QFan source, what temperature do you want to monitor? Now with the CPU fan, it's obviously monitoring the CPU, but with the chassis fan, you have several options here of what you want the fan to monitor. So is it the temperature of the CPU? Is it the temperature of the motherboard, the chipset, the T-sensor, or multiple sources? If I pick multiple sources, then you have the option to add in what other sources that you want it to be able to monitor. And so that could also be useful in how you have your fan set up, that you may be more concerned, or your particular system may have the chipset running faster or running hotter, and you want to make sure that your fans are running at a speed to keep the chipset as cool as possible. In my particular case, I'm continuing to monitor the CPU, still a little ill at ease with the AMD's operating temperatures being a little bit higher than I'm used to, and so I just want to make sure that I'm keeping the CPU as cool as I possibly can. And then you got the AIO pump control. If I had this enabled, I could have it as auto, DC mode, or PWM mode. And then in addition to that, let's just go ahead and show it to auto. You see that there are 3 different kind of speeds that the pump would run at based on 3 different temperatures. So you have a max, a middle, and a minimum duty cycle, which are tied to temperatures for each of those definitions. So depending on what the upper temperature you have, the middle temperature, and the lower temperature, that would dictate then how fast you might want to have the pump moving at those various levels. And then obviously going faster, the higher the temperature. In my particular case, since I don't have an AIO, we have that disabled. And then we have the active VRM HS fan enabled. Mine's enabled. Again, it is running, but I'm not getting a speed on it. And so that's something I need to find out if there's something with my BIOS or something with the fan, or just something the way that it's set up. So that's the monitor section. It's pretty straightforward. A lot of the major information, again, is shown over on the right-hand side on every page, so this is something that you always have access to. But if you want to take a little deeper dive into seeing how other aspects of the system are running, this is the place you come and check. Next up, we have the boot heading, and there are only a few items here to go through. The first one is boot configuration. And boot configuration has a number of entries, beginning with fast boot. In fast boot, it's a little misnomer from my perspective, because what it really should be is fast shutdown, or not quite shutdown, or not power off. Because how this works is the system won't fully turn off. Instead, the system goes kind of in a hibernated state, which enables the OS to pick up where it left off much faster for a faster boot. However, not having the system fully shut down could create some issues for some systems. There's been issues where you're not able to actually install updates that require a shutdown because the system actually doesn't fully shut down. However, I did learn that if you do select restart when you're going through the upgrade process or the update process, the restart does effectuate a shutdown and then a restart, so you're able to do that. So in my particular case, I'm not a fan of the fast boot, and so even though I have it enabled here, I would choose to have that disabled. But if we have it enabled, then you can see what happens on the next boot after an AC power loss. So this is if the power goes out, then the system shut down. What do you want to do with the system when you boot it up the next time? And in my particular case, I have it set up for a normal boot rather than a fast boot. But again, I'm going to go to the fast boot. I'm going to disable that. And so then that isn't an issue. Next item here is the boot logo display. As you've seen, when you start up your system, on mine, I get the little Republic of Gamers logo that's on there as it starts going through the boot process. This is just giving you the option of whether we want to see that logo, see it full screen, or have it completely off. I have it auto. I don't mind seeing it. So it just goes ahead and displays. Next up is the post delay time. And this is the amount of time that between the time the system completes the post, which is the power on self-test, and then starts going through all of the BIOS setup to hand off to the operating system. The challenge is if once it starts the BIOS settings and doing the setup, you can no longer get into the BIOS then. The system is then going to hand off to the OS, and then you're going to head and start up. And so if you have this set at a really short time, it's really difficult to hit that delete or F2 key quickly enough to be able to get into the BIOS. So I have mine set at 3 seconds. The option is from 0 to 10, depending on what your need is. Like I said, I have mine set at 3 because that's a reasonable amount of time for me to see press the delete or F2 key to enter BIOS, and we're able to do that. Next option is the boot numlock state. This is whether or not the numlock feature is on or off when the system starts up. And I got to ask, I'm just curious why anybody would ever have this off. I always find it frustrating when my number keys aren't working after I start up. Now, maybe if I didn't have a number pad, maybe I got a 10 keyless keyboard. If the num lock was on, then that changes some of the key, how some of the keys work. And so maybe in that case, I'd want it off. But I've always used a keyboard that had a number pad in it. And it just always boggled my mind why you wouldn't want to have the num lock state on when the system is first powered up. So if anybody has a reason why, I'd love to know. Next up is wait for F1 if error. So if there's an error in the system through post or through the BIOS, what will happen is the system will not start up and will try to reboot. the nice thing about the wait for F1 is it will pause on the boot splash screen, typically give you a description of the error that happened, and then ask you to go ahead and press F1 to go into the BIOS. And that's always been helpful to me because then I at least know what the problem was. If I didn't see that and then all of a sudden my BIOS pops up, I know there was a problem, but what was the problem? So I always like seeing that wait for F1. But if a user doesn't need to see that or doesn't want to see that, you could disable that so it just immediately goes into the BIOS if there was an error. Next up is Option ROM messages. This was an interesting one. Option ROM is a piece of firmware that is essentially a driver that interfaces between the BIOS and hardware. This entry lets the user display any messages from the firmware or whether you just want to display the BIOS. Next up is the Interrupt 19 capture. Enabling this feature allows the BIOS to quote-unquote capture Interrupt 19. Capturing the interrupt will allow any adapters that may be needed or want to function as bootable disks to be able to boot up from those host adapters. So for example, if your system was using a separate IDE or SCSI, and I always wondered, is SCSI, is that sexy, skizzy, scuzzy? There was always some debate about how that was pronounced. If you have one of those adapters plugged into your motherboard with drives attached to that, you may want to then have Interrupt 19 enabled because then it would allow those adapters to capture that interrupt, which would then allow drives attached to those adapters to be able to act as boot drives. Next up is AMI native NVMe driver support. AMI is American Megatrends, which is the company that's created this BIOS. And native NVMe driver support allows NVMe drives to be able to act as boot drives. So I have mine on because all I have in this particular system is an NVMe drive anyway, as we'll see when we get to the boot order. So I want to make sure that I'm able to boot up from that drive. And as we have advanced in this current generation of being able to have these NVMe drives, the way they attach and work within the data lanes is a little bit different than how drives worked previously. So being able to have this NVMe driver support, which is going to start becoming basically de facto going forward, was important at one time because those NVMe quote-unquote disks couldn't function as boot up drives. But by having this native driver support, it allows that to happen. Next up, you have setup mode. And all this is when BIOS starts, what menu do you want to start in? Advanced mode or easy mode? I have mine in advanced mode, so when it comes in, it comes right to the advanced mode. So that's it for the boot configuration. Next up is CSM, which is Compatibility Support Module. And this is for systems that are using very old operating systems or option ROMs that do not support the UEFI interface. In that case, then you would enable this option to be able to boot into your system. In my case, I don't have either, so under Launch CSM, I have that disabled. Next up is Secure Boot. Secure Boot is a feature in the UEFI that only allows quote-unquote approved operating systems to boot up. This security feature is designed to prevent malware from taking over the PC during boot up. And there's some debate out there as to how well it works. I have my OS type on Windows UEFI mode, so it can boot up right to Windows. If I wanted, I could have an other OS, which would be a non-Windows operating system like various versions of Linux or something else that might be out there. But I have the Windows UEFI mode, and then if I wanted to, I could then have key management as part of that boot up process. And this key management basically means that there are certificates that verify that the code being run during boot up is not malicious or some type of malware. I got to be honest, I'm not that experienced with this, and a lot of this doesn't, I just don't understand how a lot of it works. But I found this information on Microsoft.com. I'll provide a link to it on my website if anybody's interested in wanting to get more information. But you have a number of keys that would be used to make sure that the keys are unlocking and are valid in order to allow boot up to happen. And again, this is to prevent malicious code from taking over the system. So PK is a public key or a platform key. KEK is a key exchange key. Then you got DB management is allow a signature from a specific database. And then you have DBX management, which is a forbidden signature database. So I'm assuming that if certain signatures come up that have already been flagged, it would not allow a boot up if one of those keys was seen. And you could see save to a file, set a new key, append a key, or delete a key are the options in all of these. And then after secure boot, we have boot option priority. In my case, I only have the one drive, so all I'm going to be able to choose from is the Windows Boot Manager on my NVMe drive. Otherwise, I would disabled, in which case then the system wouldn't boot up. It would just go into BIOS, and then I would see the BIOS. But if I had a number of drives in the system, I would be able to choose which drive I want to be the boot drive. And I could have a number of drives in the system with a number of different operating systems, and I'd be able to choose in different circumstances which one I want to be able to boot into, depending on what my need is at that point in time. And in addition to that, that creates a boot override. Again, if I had more disks on here, there would be a number of options that may be filled in depending on what data was on those disks. And I could come into BIOS, make some changes and say, you know what, I don't want to go into my normal C drive. Let me override that and let me use, maybe I got a USB stick plugged in. Maybe I got another drive that's in there that I'm running tests on or something. Maybe I have a drive with Linux on it. I want to run Linux. So you can override whatever the standard boot is and then just be able to click on the specific drive. In this case, if I just click on this, it will go ahead and then just boot up from that drive, which is really no different than what a standard boot would be. So that's it for the monitor and the boot section. We just have a couple of more headings to go through, and I think we'll be able to cover those in one more video. So I appreciate anybody who's been using this as a reference. Again, this is really for reference and not intended for somebody to listen through all the way through. But if you had some questions on specific entries, here's a place to go to be able to find out what those entries. So I hope to see you in our next one, and thanks for watching. My head's still spinning from all of the entries in the AI tweaker in the advanced section. So it was a nice little change of pace to be able to do the monitor and boot section today. I am curious though why my VRM fan isn't showing up in the monitor section. So I got to do a little bit more research on that to see why that's the case. We got one more video to go to complete this series. So please consider liking and subscribing if you're finding this information at all useful. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one.